Are you ever frustrated by the gap between your ideals and reality? Well, rhetoric might just be the bridge you're looking for. Welcome back, friends. It's always a pleasure to have you here, especially when we get to talk about the deep-down value of rhetoric. It's the art of getting people on the same page, of persuasion, of coordinating social action, of remedying misunderstandings, and it's really practical in a way that a lot of disciplines just aren't. I can't help but poke fun at the problems I had to solve in my high school physics class, where we had to calculate things like force, mass, acceleration, and more in an imaginary realm where there was neither friction nor gravity. And I understand that it was to keep the math simple. To paraphrase my high school physics teacher, we can't teach you the real stuff, so we teach you the stuff that isn't true because you can handle it. But I was still bothered by what felt like an exercise in the inane, going through the motions of solving equations that described the physics of fiction. Everyday life bombarded me with friction, gravity, and air resistance, so it felt really disingenuous to say that we were really learning anything by solving these kinds of problems. And I've mentioned before how I find the philosopher's search for incontrovertible truth to be a little bit tiresome. Descartes said that "I think, therefore I am" was the only thing he could know for certain because, after all, his perception of all the people around him could have been an illusion. And okay, but whether the people around me are an illusion or not, I still have to treat them as if they're real and have feelings. So I don't know what this Cartesian process really gets us. But I also understand the appeal of imagining and striving towards ideals. It's good to aspire to absolute truth, but it's also important to live like a decent human being now. Practical reality isn't going to go away, even if we wish it would, to simplify the calculations. Having and aspiring towards ideals is normal and human, and our ideals rightly drive much of our public and private discussions. We want a world without violence, without poverty, without sickness and greenhouse gases. We want A's with minimal efforts, health without exercise, and roommates who do the dishes without delay. Even that stern philosopher Plato imagined his own utopian republic. But, of course, as easy as it is to imagine a perfect world, you don't probably need me to tell you that we do not live in that perfect world. Far from it. In fact, most of our ideals are, in large part, often completely unachievable in a practical sense. That doesn't mean that we need to give up on our ideals, though, and this is where I think rhetoric can be a really useful tool. Holding to our ideals too tightly makes us rigid and intractable, and it sets us up for frustration and disappointment. What happens when you think the world would be better without friction and then you keep running into it? Well, that's a short road to resentment. But with a rhetorical mindset, you realize that you can really only work with practical reality and not ideals. And that's not to say that you give up on your ideals and tell people whatever they want to hear, but it does mean that you recognize and work within the gap between your ideals and reality. With rhetoric, you don't get stuck yelling at life for not being how you wish it was. Instead, you work with life as it is, and today we'll talk about how. The scholar Richard McKeon has said that rhetoric in all its applications is focused on the particular, not the universal. Particular questions or constitutions in law, particular works or compositions in art, or particular facts or data in experience and existence. In this, I see the idea that rhetoric lives in the real world. It's not making pronouncements about human nature in general or the abstract concept of art. Instead, we use rhetoric to deal with a particular disagreement between two people or to review a particular movie or TV show. When we're doing rhetorical things, we might apply larger ideas to whatever we're working on, but it doesn't change the fact that we're working to solve a particular problem in the real world, whether that's helping two people to get along or warning someone not to waste their time on a particular show. And this almost feels like common sense, but it's something that I see less experienced writers and more experienced politicians struggle with all the time. No one of us has the power to enact universal change, and yet we often make arguments that are sweeping universal appeals to our ideals instead of practical attempts to improve reality. For example, I once worked with a writer who started out on a project aimed at what she described as a severe lack of women in engineering. And though she didn't use these terms exactly, it was clear that her ideal scenario was complete equality in genders across all fields of engineering. But it's one thing to state your ideals, and it's another entirely to enact a change in the world, and for the latter, you need to work with particulars. In the end, ideals are just ideas, and they can't really get anything done. So this writer's project was fundamentally unrealistic, not because gender equality is a fool's errand, but because she hadn't yet accounted for reality. Her project wasn't going to make a change in the real world, because it wasn't actually trying to. In Plato's Phaedrus, we read a discussion between the philosopher Socrates and the rhetorician Lysias, and they talk about the value of writing, rhetoric, and various kinds of lovers. You know, the usual. At one point, though, Plato's Socrates describes the human soul as being driven by a charioteer who has to deal with two different horses at the same time, a noble steed and a passionate reprobate. As he describes it, I imagine something like everyone's charioteer running the horses around the inside of a bowl. The noble horse pulls the chariot up towards enlightenment, and the other one pulls the chariot down. The goal here is to drive the chariot over the top edge of the bowl into the realm of enlightenment, where everything exists in an idealized and beautiful form. But most people, at best, only catch a glimpse of that ideal world before tumbling back down to the real world to start the climb all over again. With the dazzling self-confidence typical of some philosophers, Socrates asserts that the only way to escape the bowl and enter the realm of enlightenment is through the power of philosophy. Okay then. But for the rest of us who aren't part of that exclusive club of philosophers, I think there's still value here. Socrates says of beauty, we saw her there, shining in company with the celestial forms, and coming to earth, we find her here too. But rather than seeing the ideal form of beauty, we instead see beauty reflected not in its ideal form, but in everyday things and people. This particular worldly beauty, then, pushes people to strive ever higher and higher to achieve that enlightenment once again. And here's why I care about all this. We do not live in an ideal world, but we can imagine one and use that understanding to help us make our rough and complex world a little bit more ideal. We could look at the world and just say it will never be the way I really want it to be, so let's just burn it all down. Or we could think rhetorically and say there's a real gap between my ideals and reality, but I can bridge that gap and make a real positive difference. Sure, we can keep running our horses around and around until we finally launch ourselves into the realm of idealized spheres, but we can also use our glimpses of the ideal to improve everyday life in the meantime too. So, back to the writer who is trying to make more space for women in the field of engineering. I like to imagine our ideals as finely polished, perfectly smooth forms. And this writer's glimpse of an ideal realm was one where all the women who wanted a place in the discipline of engineering had one. But she quickly realized that it wasn't going to be as simple as writing a 10-page paper describing her ideal scenario. Reality wasn't just going to comply with her wish. For one, she realized that it was going to be practically impossible to get more women engineers without first getting more women engineering majors. If you don't train people first, it will be hard to get them into the profession. So, rather than writing a sincere and admirable description of her effectively useless ideal, this writer shifted her focus to dealing with a practical issue in real life. Where ideals are smooth and polished, reality is rough and irregular. Our ideals and our reality are ultimately incompatible. They don't fit or connect. So we need something to go in between, something to hold them together. And that's the work that rhetoric can do. It works like a bridge or like glue between ideals and reality, making them compatible. And that's how this writer started to think. Instead of saying there should be more women in engineering, she wrote a paper outlining a plan for providing peer mentors for women who were first-year engineering students at a particular university, all in order to give them a greater sense of belonging in the field and more support and mentorship along the way. And this was something that her research showed men in the program already had in abundance. She wasn't going to write a paper that by itself would make her ideals a reality, but what she did do was write a really effective argument persuading a particular audience to do a particular thing in order to make reality a little more like her ideal. Now, it's crucial to recognize that this was not a surrender. This writer did not abandon her ideals, and neither should any of us. Instead, she recognized the wide gap between her ideals and reality, and with a thoughtful rhetorical strategy, she was able to put her focus on the change she could bring about, instead of just shouting and wondering why nothing was happening. And there are all kinds of ways to use rhetorical strategies to bridge that gap. It just depends on what's causing the split between ideals and reality. You might need to adjust your expectations based on a limited budget, or maybe you need to address root issues before addressing a major problem, or perhaps you need to compromise with a group who has drastically different values from you. No matter what, we'll ultimately come up against some kind of practical limitation that prevents our ideals from becoming reality. And in those cases, we could just fold our arms and shout until they make us drink hemlock, or we could practice the kind of intellectual humility that Charles Bazerman described when he said, "Writers often have great ambitions about the effects and power of what they write and their ability to capture the truth of realities or conjure imagined realities, but they are constantly caught up short by what they can bring into shared reality through words. Recognizing the limitations of our representations can lead us to appropriate modesty and caution about what we and others write, and about decisions and calculations made on the basis of the representations. That is, we have the opportunity to navigate the gap between our glimpses of the ideal and our daily struggles to represent them in reality. And that is what rhetoric is all about." It's good to have ideals, and it's good to work to achieve them. The trouble comes in thinking that by describing our ideals, we are doing something to achieve them. The fact of the matter is that telling people what we want is not the same as taking steps to actually make it happen. Because rhetoric is focused on the practical and the particular, it won't justify us in thinking we've done a good job when all we've done is contemplate our ideal realms free of friction and gravity. Instead, rhetoric forces us to be mindful of practical realities and to work with and around them as we strive to achieve our ideals. Rhetoric bridges the gap and helps us to make progress rather than sit and stew over how different the world is from how we think it should be. It helps us to make meaningful changes rather than idealistic wish lists. And that's not to diminish philosophers and their search for absolute truth over the edge of our little bowl of chariots. It's just to acknowledge that there's a whole lot of life to live in the meantime, and rhetoric is an invaluable tool to do it, whether that's dealing with a society that falls short of our greatest expectations, or a roommate who remains vexingly aloof to the dishes piling up in the sink. But that's enough for now. I'm always grateful that you choose to spend this time with me to talk about the good stuff. Let me know what you're thinking about in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.